Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 6th week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. Since 1990, the program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV, YouTube, and archive.org, where our programs can be found. This is program number 368. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, quote, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things on a shut down, shut up edition of News from Neptune. With thanks, as usual, to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research, No's notes, which I don't always get to the extent that they deserve on the show, are posted on the on the News from Neptune Facebook page. Don't miss them. They're also on the Aware Facebook page for another program that we do here. We try to bear in mind the murdered Rosa Luxemburg's remark from a century ago. The most revolutionary thing you can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. We will begin tonight with David's list.
Well, the obvious thing to say is that this whole deficit thing is a big hoax.
Shut down, shut up.
And to understand why it's a hoax takes a little bit of work, but nevertheless, it's a hoax. It isn't as if the federal government could run any deficit.
Exactly.
It wants to, but it can run whatever deficit it needs to in order to put people to work in productive ways. But of course, when we're talking about the deficit in the mainstream media, it's never a matter of whether or not you're going to put people to work, or whether you or not you're going to provide a basic, decent standard of living to everyone. It's a matter of whether whether the government is quote unquote in debt. And of course, the main fallacy there is that the government, the federal government, isn't your household. It isn't your local government. It isn't your state government. It isn't a business, large or small. It is the federal government, which prints its own money. And it can have as much money printed as it wants and needs for good stuff or bad stuff. And the question is, when the government goes into debt and increases the deficit to scary numbers like 20 trillion or 21 trillion or a trillion or whatever it's going to be, it doesn't really matter except for what the effect that money has, whether it's spent on war, whether it's spent in a way that that spies on us, that surveils us, or whether it's spent on ways on providing us with health care and so forth. So unless we start at that point, I don't see how we can have, we meaning our society, I don't see how we can have an intelligent and fruitful discussion of what all this deficit business is really about in this sort of neoliberal context. So that's what I'll put on the table to start with. There are many ways of going with this. People are talking about, of course, the stock market and what it means and what this fallback means or what this crash means. Doug Hedwood.
Correction.
Correction.
Yes.
Doug Hedwood on his Behind the News radio program and podcast yesterday, which you can listen to as a podcast, did about a 10-minute analysis of what the stock market is. About 20 years ago, Doug Hedwood wrote a book called Wall Street, which is still a good source for understanding how Wall Street works. And in fact, many of the things he wrote about in this book, and there's some pretty technical issues involved in how Wall Street works, many of the things he wrote in that book were kind of prescient in terms of what has happened in the last 20 years and how these concerns about Wall Street sort of dominate the news cycle and dominate how we think about how our economy is doing. But it becomes ever more clear, whether you read the New York Times or the local paper or listen to anything besides the alternative media, meaning, reading websites like Counterpunch or listening to the Real News Network, it becomes very clear that it's just taken for granted that when workers are doing better,
yes,
it's a threat to the ruling elite in this country.
That is the crucial point.
They don't even hide that anymore.
Right.
It's like, you're doing better, we're worried.
That'll mean inflation.
Liberals,
Yes.
conservative, Democrats, Republicans, whatever, we're worried. They're intelligent people are worried if workers' wages are marginally going up.
Exactly.
Meaning pressure to raise prices will marginally go up, meaning the value of stocks might go down in terms of this chain of events that is supposed to happen whenever workers get a little more money, not that they've gotten a lot more money.
And that's exactly right. Paul Ryan, of all people, says last week the advantages of the new tax bill show up in the fact that some workers are getting $1.50 more a week.
Yeah.
As if that means anything at all.
Yeah.
It does, in the sense that you're talking about.
Yeah.
That's exactly what's scaring the wealthy, and the very reason that this correction in the stock market took place, because of that $1.50 a week that some workers are getting now. It's just incredible, and it shows how almost a generation of austerity in Europe and the U.S. Serves the interests of a very small percentage of the community. Those who control wealth and power. Yeah. It's amazing.
Yeah, but what the kind of interesting and thing about all this is what's going on is that in some ways, and Robert Pollan was interviewed a couple of times on the Real News Network about these issues and the stock market and the economy and so forth. He's the guy who runs the Political Economy Research Institute at UMass Amherst, and is a pretty reliable source. I've got some issues with him on some other issues, but I'll leave that aside for now. I think he lays it out pretty well. But what's interesting that's going on now is that you had this big tax cut a few weeks ago, which went mainly to the rich, of course. And now you have this budget deal, which doesn't quite accede to the austerity agenda, but says we're going to throw a few tens of billions of dollars at the military. We're going to throw a few tens of $100 or 100 something billions of dollars for the next couple of years to the non-military part of the discretionary federal budget, meaning that housing and stuff like that, energy and housing, education, will kind of maintain itself, and nothing horrible is going to happen. They're kind of waiting for the hammer to fall, and it's obvious why the Congress is doing that. Because the House especially, obviously, every one of them is up for election. And given that everybody understands those tax cuts were mainly for the rich, they need to do something to run on, and so they agreed. The Republicans and Democrats basically agreed, and probably rightfully so, that they kind of got to keep this thing going. And in doing that, they're actually they're sort of implicitly acknowledging that deficits really don't matter.
Yes.
And so we're back to the Ronald Reagan era. During the Reagan era, the taxes were cut, the deficits ballooned. Everybody was panicked. They basically ballooned in terms of military spending. Now it's kind of half and half between military spending and quote-unquote social spending, but still they acknowledge that really, yes, the federal government does print its own money. Now, we're going to wait to see in the next year or two whether the austerity mongers, whether the people who want to cut cut Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, whether they're going to ever get around to doing what they're doing. But whenever is going to be a good political time for doing that. They're acknowledging that now isn't that time.
And it is a problem there because, of course, one of the things that the Congress up for re-election, as you point out, can do is say, well, look, there's a crisis. Something terrible is about to happen. We have to take steps to deal with that, and we're doing it for you. And that way, the shock doctrine, as it's been called, works to the advantage of the austerity, audacity too, of the austerity that that Congress has been backing for years. So, yeah, there's a real problem. You mentioned Doug Henwood, friend of this ground, and he has a comment writing about the stock panic this last week. This correction,
which is a longer version of the same thing he sort of read on his podcast. Yeah.
Henwood says, whether you measure by conventional indicators like GDP and productivity growth, or more humane ones like the capacity to deliver a decent and stable standard of living to people with less than six-figure incomes, this economy is anything but strong. Signs of wage increases should not be occasions for panic, but when the economy is organized around the needs of the top 10%, they are. There's the real threat, so to speak, of the current economy. Steps will be taken, and it'll be taken out of the effective paycheck that the majority receive in order to make sure that that threat does not come to fruition. This is the panic that will be induced by the stock market correction of this last week, and the question of whose interest it serves is clear. Shut down, shut up. Right?
It's important to note at the more sort of analytical level, the micro level of understanding these things. I believe Pollan and Dean Baker and people like that when they say that it isn't a bubble like what we had with the housing bubble in 2008 or with the dot-com, prior to 2008 really, and the dot-com bubble in the late 90s, which burst in 2000. And that's the way elites like it. I mean, they don't want a crisis. They just kind of want to slowly squeeze as much money out of the working class and accumulate as much wealth as they possibly can without a few ups and downs. They want to keep the people, the voters, sort of thinking that things are going to get a tiny bit better like they did when they got a little tiny bit of money thrown at them from this tax cut. They don't want the workers worried too much, but it's this gradual process, and they're running out of ways. They're running out of ways to accumulate wealth. I mean, they've attacked workers' wages for 40 years. There isn't that much money more they can get. They go overseas and they make money doing that, paying workers nothing and exploiting resources in other countries. China isn't what it used to be in that regard. I don't think, or the rest of the world. And we have to spend so much money on military spending to kind of keep that all going. So they get into that. They get when they can't do that anymore, then they deal with the stock market, or they go into Bitcoin. They find speculative ways of making money. These don't work very well for very long. But they don't necessarily threaten the entire economy with a crash. But it's just that things are going to sort of stabilize, and the 1%, which has increased its share of the national wealth from something like 20-30% to more like 40-50%. They're just going to keep going that. It's hard to see actually where it's going to all fall apart, and so that's kind of what people are waiting for. And so it's probably not correct to kind of see this as 2008 all over. We'll just have to wait to see what happens with with all this. And the fact that the Congress passed this budget means that the Congress is kind of down with kind of moving things along very, very slowly, pretending they're getting a little bit better when in fact they're getting marginally worse, but not as bad as they were in 2008.
And it's important to see that this is a systemic problem, not just a problem of the Republicans or the Democrats or the administration, which, interestingly enough, has had very little to do with it. It's the bloviating that we get from the presidency, but the actual concerns about making sure that most Americans don't prosper from the American economy, that's up to both of the political parties and to Congress. And we saw that this week. The problem is systemic, though. It's not just bad decisions by the people we send to Washington, or who send themselves to Washington. And that's pointed out by similar problems going on in Germany right now, in a different political situation and a different economic situation too, but one that has remarkable similarities because of the general systemic nature of the situation, the fact that these are capitalist and indeed neoliberal, which is basically turbocharged capitalism. These are neoliberal problems, and the situation in Germany acts as almost sort of a distorting mirror for us, can show us features of our situation which are not quite so obvious but turn up as being more obvious there. It's been pointed out by the fight this last week, or the culmination of a fight this last week, to form a government in Germany. Germany has a parliamentary system, and therefore they need to have a government with the backing of a majority in the Bundestag, in the parliament. And in order to do that, they have to take the results of the last election and put together a government that is a coalition of these various groups. Well, that's finally happened this week, weeks after the German election. And the best comment on it that I saw came from the actually quite admirable Sarah Wagenknecht. Wagenknecht is the head of the chairperson of the left faction in the German parliament, and she gave a thumbnail sketch of the establishment of a coalition government of Angela Merkel's conservatives and the SPD, the socialist by name party that was accomplished this week. The conservatives, Christian Democrats and their allies, and Wagenknecht says, the Christian Democrats and socialists have not decided on imposing a tax on the super rich and corporations. They will say there will not be enough money for the necessary investments, the social spending, that the society needs. And we have to realize this is a society that does much more in terms of social spending than the U.S. does. Health care, education, housing, child allowances, things like that. But she's pointing out that the capitalist parties, which even the Socialist Party in Germany is, have made an arrangement where they'll be able to say there's not enough money to do the sorts of things that we should be doing in the society. The lack of housing and social workers, low salaries, and beggarly pensions will continue to affect negatively the lives of billions of people. And as I say, completely different level from this country, but the same relationship of forces. Instead of lowering the level of militarization, the new government, on the contrary, relies on further strengthening the army and increasing arms exports. Now, this is very interesting because the scale here is very different. The military budget, the German military budget, is a fraction, even proportionally, of the American military budget. And the arms exports, which are indeed a part of the German economy, once again, are a small fraction of what the U.S. and even Britain does in this regard. So the situations are parallel in a way. The interesting difference is that Germany has a political formation, a left party, that can point this out. one of the most remarkable things in this last political year and so forth in this country has been the emergence of a political faction that looked like doing something of the same sort. The socialist word was introduced into American politics for the first time in a long time by the Sanders campaign, although the Sanders campaign finally knuckled under, and the Sanders campaign was never good on the important, perhaps the most important factor in the American economy these days, the military. So by looking into the German mirror, we can see perhaps a reflection that accentuates the things that we do wrong and who does them.
So from a relatively non-informed perspective on this particular issue, the question that would arise in my mind is what we've seen in the last this neoliberal period, the same 40 years, is the evolution of the European Union and the implementation of the common currency, the euro, which has been to Germany's favor, sort of competitive favor, up until this point, because it takes its advantage as an exporter to control the manner in which the European economy works to its favor, even though it doesn't have control over that economy in the same way that the U.S. Congress has control over the economy in this country. So are they sort of being hoisted by their own petard in this sense? Because they can't do what the U.S. Congress could do. They don't control their currency. They have to accede to
yes and no.
The European Central Bank.
What happens? Yeah, you might regard the situation as the German, because of the strength of the German economy and the dominance of the German economy in Europe, you might say that what Germany has done in the euro is extended its currency to the continent, or to the 24 EU countries, given the control of the economy of Europe that Germany exercises. So in some sense, the difference might almost be compared to the federal government and the states, and the EU and the European states, on the other hand, with Germany exercising a control that looks as more like the federal government than say, Arizona's control.
Yeah. Well, that's perhaps a technical question, but I haven't followed it that closely to know what the parallels or differences might be. But they're all, everybody's scrambling in this context, in this global context, to maintain their place within this neoliberal system.
Exactly.
And not much good could come out of it until this neoliberal system continues to work the way that it works.
A parallel that occurs to me that would have to be adjusted a great deal for scale, but maybe something like what we're talking about here, is what the European Union did to Greece and what the federal government did to Puerto Rico. In each case, there was a crisis. The obvious differences in scale here, but the level of suffering, so to speak, in the subject country and the subject territory is certainly comparable. And the situation is economically parallel, so to speak, given the control of the central government and what the central government doesn't do, whether the central government is the U.S. federal government or the European Union. In both cases, the results are horrendous, and sooner or later, the band is going to snap back.
Well, is this woman that you mentioned here, does she actually have any alternative proposals to the way Germany should behave? I mean, in relation to the other European countries, or to its own economy, or even as radical as like Brexit, or the dissolution of either the European Union or the common currency.
Die Linke, the left party that Wagenknecht is speaking for is roughly comparable to a Bernie Sanders run Democratic Party.
Right.
So in that sense, I mean, this is in. Anyone who has read the literature of socialism for a century, of the last century and so knows that calling this socialist is at best an extension of the meaning. Yeah. It's much closer to the sort of New Deal formulas, the New Deal economy, the attempt to take the edge off capitalism, so to speak, that existed in America because of the desperate nature of the situation from the Depression through the 1970s. That's what Sanders were proposing. Yeah. That's basically what Die Linke in Germany is proposing. Yeah. They are welfare state programs, as they used to be called, but they're programs that are anathema to the neoliberal circles that run the economy of both the U.S. and Europe. And that's where the fight is and where the fight will be carried out in the next couple of years. I don't think we should play down the significance of this fight. That is the fight that made Trump president through the convoluted workings of movements that we tend to call populist, and in part because we don't want to admit what really is going on there. So to give an account of these socialist movements in this New Deal sense is to give an account of the political changes in America and the attempt to suppress the expression of those political exchanges that we've seen so clearly both in the U.S. and Europe. Well, no, we haven't seen them clearly. That's the point. We've seen them obscurely, but effectively. And the American ruling class was entirely shocked to its core, as we've found out from reading the FBI emails, by the extent to which this issued in the election of Donald Trump. And they've worked very hard to make sure that Donald Trump is the weakest American president we've had since before the Great Depression. And they've succeeded. Yeah.
And it's interesting in terms of our opening comments about our own economy. We didn't even mention Trump because it's like he's sort of disappeared into this establishment rhetoric of looking at things. He still is doing and saying outlandish things of various kinds, and sometimes relatively sensible things. But still, there is. It doesn't matter. Important. It doesn't matter.
Exactly.
But the other thing I wanted to say in a more irreverent note was that Europe. I try to follow. The problem with Europe is there's just too many countries, and you try to.
They've tried to sort that out a couple of times.
I know they're trying to make it like all one big country.
Exactly.
But that doesn't make it. That ends up making even more confusing than less confusing in some ways, because you still have all these different countries with all these different political histories and all these different states and all these different movements, and just to understand what's going on in Spain or what's going on in Greece or whatever, it takes all your time for a while, then something else comes along. But you're right. It's really all about Germany, and to a certain extent.
To a certain extent,
it's all about Britain too. But and then France is important, but don't want to leave out France because that'll hurt their feelings. But
I'm a Venetian, so it's
But every so often I go back and read something by this guy Wolfgang Streeck. Who writes in the various leftist journals, London Review of Books and New Left Review and so forth, and because he seems to be the brilliant political economist or political sociologist of a German of our era, and he really knows the history of the German system inside out. So I've got a couple of his articles bookmarked, which I haven't as thoroughly read as I should have, but perhaps I can come up with some insight from him, although it might just muddy the waters. It's always very, very complicated, very, very complicated, especially when you go into the history of these states and these parties and the relationships of the German states to each other post unification of East Germany with West Germany.
It reminds me of a friend of mine who's a veterinarian, and she says, I once asked her, why are you an animal doctor instead of a people doctor? Why did you do that? And she said, there's so many varieties. She said, with people, there's just one system, But what I do, doing with everything from parakeets to bulldogs, there's all sorts of different systems. Well, in some sense, that's European history for you.
Yeah.
You do American history, hey, there's just one system. You go to Europe. Parallel may be reaching.
Let me mention something out of left field here, completely out of left field.
Since I'm talking about dogs.
I listened to the podcast that Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton do.
Oh, yes.
Called Moderate Rebels, and which is a takeoff on the whole Syrian thing that they've been so involved in. And they did an interview in the last week or so, which is actually the first part, I think, of two parts, they said, with a guy named Robbie Martin, who is a journalist and actually the brother of Abby Martin, who's also a journalist who's often seen on Telesur and so forth. And
when you can see Telesur.
Yeah. And this interview was about Vice, VICE. And I know nothing about
Not
Vice.
somebody named. Yeah.
I know nothing. Robbie Martin has apparently made this movie about Vice.
I see.
And apparently Vice is a thing and a big deal in a world which I know nothing about, which is most of the world, but still.
Honestly, officer, I just play piano. I have no idea what's going on upstairs.
It's the media world. It's the corporate world. It's like they keep using the word hipster. These are like Brooklyn hipsters, and apparently what started out as this magazine, or maybe more than that, has evolved into this sort of media empire, which is important enough for them to want to really understand what it means about our political culture, and especially about our kind of, partly about our corporate political culture, a little bit about the alt-right political culture, or one aspect of the alt-right. This is unfair because I'm just throwing this. Did you know anything about this? Has this crossed your? Are you like me in that you sort of stick to the main leftist sources, or have you developed a critique or an understanding of Vice over the years, and where it's come and where it's going, and how much influence it has, especially on young people?
You had me going there for a while, David, because I wasn't sure whether you're referring to Vice the publication, or Vice the practice.
Well, that's the idea. I mean, it's supposed to draw you in. Apparently, the whole from listening to this interview, the whole purpose of Vice was to draw you into this kind of darker, shadier world of the sort of edgy world, again, sort of hipster world where there's a lot going on that I don't usually consider to be relevant to the fundamental political questions that I like to deal with in my boring way. So
I'm still not clear whether you mean the publication or the activity.
The publication.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
But the publication, and apparently,
is about the activity.
A whole corporate empire surrounding this, and lots of money invested by people with lots of money who want lots of power and lots of influence into this thing. Okay.
Here is a brief thumbnail sketch of Vice, a print magazine and website focused on arts, culture, and news topics. Founded in 1994 in Montreal, Quebec. Montreal? The magazine later expanded into Vice Media, which consists of divisions including the magazine and website, a film production company, a record label, and a publishing imprint. As of February 2015, the magazine's chief creative officer was Eddie Moretti. Andrew Creighton is president, the editor-in-chief is Ellis Jones, and Alex Miller was the global head of content. And these are the people that end up getting quoted in other publications on the subject of Vice.
Okay. Well, I guess we both have some homework to do on our Vice.
They've been much involved in the sexual harassment charges recently too. Now I'm talking about the magazine. Their how shall I put it, internal relations.
Well, it's sort of the same, and this is where it's fun. I have a good time listening to the way Max Blumenthal especially talks about these things, because he's so, he talks about hipsters, but he's kind of a hipster himself, or maybe a hipster wannabe, but I mean in a good way. He has a good critical distance from what's going on, but he knows the lingo, and he kind of has a good feel for what's going on in the heads of these people. And apparently Barack Obama, when he was president, kind of cozied up to Vice a little bit. And apparently, according to this podcast, this Moderate Rebels podcast, Joe Biden kind of visited the Vice offices in Brooklyn and like hung out with these people for a while, just because that was considered the sort of good sort of Democratic Party thing to do, to reach out to this group to this demographic that Vice is involved in. And so, I don't know whether just to stay in my cozy little, I don't think I'm going to spend a lot of time reading Vice, but I don't want to, I don't want to just stay in my cozy little world and not really know what it is that people are reading and what they're being influenced by. Besides, we hear more. Obviously, we hear a lot more about Breitbart and their rising influence in the media over the last decade or two.
Yeah, I got a political friend of many years standing got after me this last week for quoting Breitbart. This was an online discussion and so forth, as if you dasn't do that because of what Breitbart is. I said, but what they're saying happened to be true. And it's at this point, I usually quote Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century theologian, who pointed out that the truth, whoever speaks it, is from the Holy Spirit. But that didn't satisfy my ex-communist friend. So.
Oh, Aquinas, he's so 4th century. If I got that right.
So well, close enough for jazz, I think.
Okay.
But the notion of this is our particular version of the much larger problem that is being very badly handled right now on questions in the midst of the Russiagate madness. And this is malign madness, too. This isn't just stupidity and misdirection. These are people who are purposely poisoning the wells of political discussion by suggesting that websites like RT, what used to be called Russia Today, are unreliable. You can't quote them, of course, because it's connected to the Russian government. Now, this is really quite remarkable and very dangerous and not an accident. Anyone who has been paying attention knows that RT is at least as reliable as, say, the BBC. And the British Broadcasting Company. They are both government-financed institutions the job of which is to present news. In fact, if you look at the BBC, particularly since the Thatcher era, the BBC's reputation for objectivity and accuracy has been thoroughly besmirched. They deserve it. RT today, I find, to be one of the most reliable sources for general news. When I want to listen to the news in the morning, I don't turn on CNN. I go to RT. My friend would say, that's a clear indication, of how misled you're being, and the important things that are being said that by various political groups are being censored here in a serious way. Our researcher, Dr. No, points out that Google and YouTube is kind of part of Google, agree to take some measures towards censoring RT at government orders. this sort of quietly emerges in these last weeks. Where are the limits of allowable debate for these proprietors? Google's corporate whoredom has limits. That is, how much it will sell out to these governments. Probably has some limits. They want to maintain some semblance of independence. But in fact, they're willing to do the government bidding, and specifically in this fog of Russiagate nonsense. YouTube representative YouTube, as I say, as part of the Google empire, YouTube Representative Juniper Downs, head of policy is her title at YouTube, says YouTube is happy to cooperate with the UK, Britain, in doing a search for Russian interference. The whole Russian interference thing, which buying ads on Facebook before the election, but has extended to Britain. The Brits are upset about it in the same way the same circles in America are. And YouTube says, hey, we're happy to censor this foreign operation for you. Downs also said there's no evidence of Russian interference in the Brexit vote. This was the vote on Britain leaving the EU. But Google claims they don't have any evidence of that sort of interference, but it might be there, and therefore they'd be happy to work with the government to censor RT. MPs, just like U.S. senators, are desperate to find an excuse, members of parliament, are desperate to find an excuse to simultaneously avoid taking responsibility for the fact that the public hates the neoliberal and neoconservative accounts it gets from the news. They also think they're covering their posteriors by blaming Russia and pinning blame on social media outlets for letting unnamed Russians spend dozens of dollars, that's Dr. No's formulation, on ads, which most voters never saw. Now, this is a distinct infection from the Russiagate nonsense that comes out of the Clinton campaign after this last election. But the Brits, as usual, are happy to take their cue from Washington and say, oh, yeah, we've got to censor media now because there might be some Russians buying ads. This is incredible and hardly to be believed. And when a lot of us do, in fact, get our news from Google and YouTube and the various and sundry platforms that present stations like RT to us, this is a very real problem.
So would Chomsky, in his usual analysis, would he assert, do you think, that what you can find out on RT that's truthful are things that don't reflect poorly on the Russian government, but you really can't find out the truth about the Russian government itself? Would that be a fair critique of RT from a Chomsky perspective?
Yes and no. I think, I mean, there's obviously, these are government-funded operations, but RT has the interesting is in the interesting position in the post-Soviet world of having to prove its bona fides. That's not true of the BBC. We have this tradition in some sense justified of the independence of the BBC, particularly in the generation after the Second World War. Throughout the Second World War, there was, of course, complete media censorship in Britain. After the war in Britain, the Churchill was turfed out unceremoniously. Interesting sidelight to this is Churchill's reputation and some of the discussions that rises out of some recent movies. But in any case, what happened was that the BBC established in the Cold War, remarkably enough, a fairly good reputation for independence under tremendous pressure from the U.S. and the CIA and others to fall in with the Cold War story that U.S. media were happily spreading around the world. They resisted to some extent. That resistance really came to an end in the Thatcher years when the BBC was brought to heel, and it hasn't existed since. I would say, certainly, in recent years, in the post-Thatcher era, Since RT has appeared in the last decade, since the fall of the Soviet Union, the RT does far better as an independent source of news for the world at large than the BBC does. The BBC is thoroughly compromised. There's a very good website in Britain called Media Lens,
Right.
which
I haven't looked at them for a long time.
yeah,
but I used to.
it's worth looking at. It's sort of local in the sense that
Yeah.
is British concerns are uppermost, but it does call the BBC on the rather bad record the BBC has recently on objectivity. RT does a better job these days.
Yeah, I guess it never occurred to me that, I mean, I sort of assumed that the sort of regard that the BBC was thought of in you know, 60s, 70s, 80s was just because it was seen as sort of cool to listen to a non-American
Right.
source of news with their nice accents and all that kind of stuff. It just seemed different. It seemed kind of fun.
And in many cases, it was better.
And people would listen to the BBC World Service and
Right.
and think that they were that was putting them on the right side of things. But I never really critiqued. I never really understood whether, in retrospect, whether it was any different. I mean, and one might make perhaps a weak analogy to the way NPR evolved in this country. I think in its early days, the local stations were sort of independent to do some kind of good local journalism that I'm not sure. I'm a little out of touch with what's going on sort of in major cities, but in Chicago in the 80s, the local NPR station WBEZ did really good journalism and alternative journalism, and I don't know if that's completely gone, but I have a feeling it's much different than it was then.
I think that's quite right. As we look what happened, I mean, one of the things that happened in America after the Second World War was the foundation of independent news organization, notably the Pacifica Network from the West Coast, precisely because the tremendous devotion to propaganda on the part of mainstream media generated, as it were, an alternative. And we had a series of alternative media, primarily radio, in that generation, which has been thoroughly colonized ever since then. We could compare, in some sense, the alternative print media that grew up in the Vietnam War in this country, when the American newspapers were printing the government lies about what it was doing in Southeast Asia. So there is a pattern to these things, the sort of things that for print media, Chomsky and Herman analyzed in their important book, Manufacturing Consent, of a generation ago. The social situation of the production of media is the same. What's changed it, I think, in some ways, is the appearance of independent really independent communication systems like social media, and the effort right now is to bring those social media under control. And we read in these accounts that Dr. No has prepared for us of the way in which Google has gone along with it with overwhelming enthusiasm. It's disturbing and distressing.
And therefore, the need for some of the alternative media that we often mention on this program. And in that light, I think the Real News Network has done a couple of interviews with Stephen Cohen regarding Russia and so forth, which I find to be appealing. And maybe it's confirmation bias on my part, Carl. I don't know. There's a lot of confirmation bias going around.
We have a friend to ask about that, don't we?
But it seems like, I mean, Stephen Cohen, who is the husband of the Nation editor, Katerina Vanden Heuvel, but a professor in his own right, a venerable Russian historian, or history of Russia, historian of Russia in his own right, seems to be, in some ways, kind of a lone voice in sort of saying we're not getting this right. This is some craziness here with Russiagate and the whole thing. But beyond that, the Real News has a kind of diversity, as does Counterpunch, has a diversity in the people, and it gives us a lot of independence. I think in the people it hires to do its programming and decide what to report. They have their Baltimore crew that is doing very good journalism within the city of Baltimore, which is one of the most troubled cities in this country.
Yep.
And it's good that they're there in Baltimore, that the real news is there in Baltimore, because it's such a good example of what neoliberalism
How
does.
bad things are.
Two cities has done two cities in this kind of intense way in this relatively smaller city, and it's also done some good journalism on. I noticed a nice interview with an Israeli filmmaker, Leah Terechansky, who's done a lot of work on the situation of the African refugees in Israel that have come there from places like Eritrea and Sudan. There isn't enough background about what's going on in Sudan and Eritrea that's driving them there, and what America might have to do with that. But it does point in the midst of the whole Israel-Palestine thing, she's really also looking at the fact that the levels of hypocrisy that go on with the way refugee populations are being treated in this Israel, which can't be called democracy. It can only, as she points out, only be called ethnocracy. It's an amazingly facile and convenient way. I think Israel's legal system is just a monument to manipulating the law to support the sort of Jewish supremacism in the Israeli, Palestinian, Arab, and now African context. And people ought to know more about this. Maybe allow me to say that some of the people who might want to know about what's going on with African refugees in Israel and how they're being deported to other countries for money, and there's arms involved with this. Among those people locally might be the people who apparently organized the Dreamers, the Pro-Dreamers March a week or two ago. I guess was that last Saturday or the Saturday prior to that. No, I guess it was last Saturday.
Yes, I think so.
And have been getting good local coverage for doing their march. The march was well attended and well turned out. But it's kind of hard for me to be on board when people who describe themselves as part of an organization that promotes what they consider to be the best Jewish values, the values of welcoming the stranger and so on and so forth, don't seem to want to apply those values to that issue which Jews are most identified with, whether they like it or not, and that is Israel and Palestine and U.S. support for the policies that Israel implements against the Palestinian people and the refugees and so forth.
Is that problem worth mentioning in connection with a meeting this weekend at the quote Independent Media Center, close quote?
I'll let you make the judgment call on that. There's always I've noticed, whether it's in relation to the immigration issue, or to even the anti-war issues, which we obviously focus on, there's always kind of a way of approaching in these relatively more popular contexts in which people are trying to attract people from different backgrounds, Democratic Party and liberal, progressive, whatever, and different identity groups, etc. There's this sort of tendency to kind of focus on something that sort of strikes me as being not the way to really develop a movement that gets to the heart of these issues, to say the least. And there's a reason why we're not getting to the heart of these issues, I think, because people don't really want to expose themselves, so to speak, in quite that way.
Aren't they just being intersectional?
They are,
and that's the problem, huh?
That's behind. Yeah, that's behind. There's intersectional. There's been a lot of debate, a lot of in-your-face stuff. I know Bruce Dixon, our friend at the
Devastating.
Black
Devastating.
Agenda Report, has just, because he's a black man, he can say things, you have to admit, he says things that a white man couldn't say in a way that a white man wouldn't want to say it, okay? But he does, and
Some do.
I didn't know that there was Afro-pessimism. I didn't know what Afro-pessimism was. It's worth seeing what Bruce Dixon has to say about this and what the response is. I didn't really want to mention this, but our friend Louis Project has once again kind of he's gone after an interview that Chris Hedges did with the Socialist Equality Party, David North,
Right.
which is pretty much standard Marxist fare, opposed to intersectionality, opposed to identity politics. But Louis Project, the unrepentant Marxist, it turns out he's all for identity politics.
Yes, exactly.
It's some weird stuff going on.
Yeah, that's right.
I almost said a bad word.
Right, who do you think you are, the president?
Yeah,
huh?
yeah.
This needs more talk. Unfortunately, there is a lot of talk about it, and we are almost out of time. There are some other things that I particularly wanted to mention today. Yeah. That we will have to postpone, I think. One comment on what we were talking about earlier in terms of media critique. The best example of what happened to independent media in recent years, I think, is the case of Democracy Now! Democracy Now! Grew out of the Pacifica, the post-World War II Pacifica reforms of corporate media, and through those through the end of the 20th century, the Democracy Now! Emerged as a star in this independent news media. They were a inspiration to News from Neptune when News from Neptune was founded as a radio program before you were born, probably. But what's happened to Democracy Now! In the recent years, roughly since the election of Barack Obama, is not to be believed. It is also bound up with this question of identity politics, but it wasn't just identity politics that needs to be dealt with there. We also have to talk about the other influences that reduced the original impulse for independent media in Democracy Now! To the rather sad state it's in today.
Yeah, not completely sad state. I mean,
Not
they
completely.
still have they do some stuff. I know with the Daniel Ellsberg thing recently, or whoever it was, I forget who was it that came out with the Daniel Ellsberg stuff. It was
Gar Alperovitz
Alperovitz,
is discussed in an important article in the New Yorker, the last issue, and that's about the Pentagon Papers, the exposure of the study of the real reasons for the Vietnam War, and it's the parallel is brought up now with contemporary whistleblowers. There's no question that the internet and social media have presented a real threat to the manufacture of consent that was possible when you only had 3 television stations and local radio and radio networks across the country. That's been opened up, and you probably can't get the worms back into the can because they're out there. But still in all, they're trying, and in terms of censorship of news and the control of its being spread abroad, we're setting new records, and that's not good.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the main issues, the ghosts that sort of haunt this whole process have to do with the choices that people have to make regarding whether they're going to continue to maintain hope in the Democratic Party.
Other people who think that?
The idea, pardon?
Nothing. Go ahead.
Well, there's, people are, they play their cards and then they maybe collect their cards and play them again. But, and I understand that. But it's like behind that is, am I really a socialist? What does it really mean to be a socialist? What does it mean to be anti-war? What is neoliberalism? Is the Democratic Party, is there any hope that the Democratic Party is ever really, that this Sanders wing is ever going to really take over the Democratic Party? And what about identity politics? And why, what about race and class? All these things kind of hover around, and they're never really resolved in any sense of having a movement, although I think they've been pretty satisfactorily resolved in the thinking and actions of some of the people on the left who want to deal with the Democratic Party, but have no hopes that could ever possibly be anything other than a corporate party.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 6th week of 2018, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young. This has been a Shut Down, Shut Up edition. With thanks to Research Director Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, the third man on News from Neptune. No's notes are posted on Facebook, on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. They contain an elaboration of and links to what we've been saying this evening. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.